Somewhere along the way, many of us started carrying things we were never meant to hold. Quiet fears, invisible expectations, the pressure to be everything for everyone. We smile through exhaustion, say yes when we're screaming no inside, and keep old memories locked away in the corners of our hearts and homes, even when they hurt more than they help. And the truth is, all of that weight, it adds up. Not in pounds, but in heaviness. The kind that sits quietly on your chest and makes peace feel just out of reach. In the teachings of the Buddha, we're reminded of a simple yet profound truth. The root of suffering is attachment. And when we cling, whether to people, to things, or even to who we used to be, we close ourselves off from the deep peace that comes with letting go. Today we're going to explore what it really means to release what no longer serves you. Not in a vague, inspirational quote kind of way, but in real, grounded steps that can actually change how you feel when you wake up tomorrow. So if you're feeling tired, emotionally cluttered, or just longing for a sense of clarity, this video is for you. Stay with me all the way through. Each part we'll explore builds on the last, and I don't want you to miss even a single piece of this journey. And hey, if you appreciate what we're doing here, this little corner of the internet where we slow down, reflect, and reconnect, there's a simple free favor I'll ask. Hit that subscribe button. It helps more than you know, and it means we can keep sharing this space with others who need it, just like you. You know that feeling when you're trying to hold it all together? Your own life, your responsibilities, your emotions, and someone else comes along, pouring all of their stress, chaos, and drama into your lap. You listen, you care, you show up again and again. But slowly, without even realizing it, their problems become your problems, their pain becomes your pain, and suddenly, you're walking through your own life with an invisible weight pressing on your chest, wondering why you feel so tired, so heavy, so off. We often think that being a good friend, partner, sibling, or parent means carrying other people's burdens, that it's our duty to absorb their pain, to fix what's broken, to be their emotional anchor. But here's the hard truth. That kind of constant emotional labor is not sustainable. And more importantly, it's not the kind of compassion the Buddha taught us. True compassion in Buddhist philosophy isn't about self-sacrifice. It's about presence. It's about being with someone in their suffering without becoming consumed by it. There's a beautiful teaching in Buddhism called compassion with wisdom. The idea is that while we should open our hearts to others, we must also stay grounded in our own center. Otherwise, our love becomes entangled with attachment, and our kindness turns into quiet resentment. Think about that for a second. How many times have you said yes out of guilt, or felt drained after helping someone because you felt like you had to, not because you truly had the space? That's not peace, that's pressure. Let me tell you a story. There was a woman named Layla who was known in her family as the strong one. Everyone came to her when they needed something: advice, money, emotional support. She would answer every call, show up at every crisis, and never said no. But after years of this, she started waking up with a tightness in her chest. She couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, and slowly she began to lose touch with her own needs. She realized one day, after crying in her car for no clear reason, that she had been living everyone else's life except her own. Layla found her way to a local meditation group where the teacher shared a quote from the Buddha that changed everything for her. You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. And something clicked. She had been so focused on being there for others, she'd completely forgotten to show up for herself. Slowly she started setting boundaries, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. She learned to listen without always trying to fix, to be available without being on call 24/7, to say, I love you, but I also need time to take care of me. And you know what happened? Her relationships didn't fall apart. They got healthier. because when she stopped rescuing everyone, they started stepping into their own strength. And she finally had the space to breathe. In Buddhist practice, we talk a lot about the concept of non-attachment. But that doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop clinging. You stop tying your sense of peace to someone else's emotional weather. You can still be deeply loving, deeply supportive, but from a place of wholeness, not depletion. There's a quiet kind of tension that builds up in us over time. It shows up when you agree to do something you really don't want to do, when you nod and smile while your gut is begging you to say no. Maybe it's a social event that drains you, a work favor you don't have time for, or a family obligation that pulls you in too many directions. You say yes to avoid conflict, to seem nice, to keep the peace. But little by little, you start losing your own voice in the process. It's so common, and yet we rarely talk about it, this fear of saying no. We think that turning someone down means letting them down. We worry that if we set a boundary, people will see us as selfish, rude, or unkind. And so we bite our tongues, stretch ourselves thin, and quietly carry the weight of everyone else's expectations. But here's the truth. Constantly saying yes when your heart says no is a form of self-abandonment. And no one wins when you betray yourself to please others. Buddhism teaches us the importance of right speech and right action, living in a way that aligns with our truth. Saying no is not about rejection or resistance, it's about clarity. It's about honoring your own capacity, your own energy, your own peace. The Buddha never taught us to become martyrs for the comfort of others. Instead, he pointed us toward balance, the middle way, where we can love others without losing ourselves. Think of this like a garden. If you pour all your water into someone else's soil, what happens to your own roots? They dry up, and eventually you have nothing left to give. That's not kindness, that's depletion. Real kindness includes yourself. Real compassion begins at home, within your own body and mind. I remember hearing about a man named James who always said yes to everything. He was the dependable one, the guy who stayed late at work, showed up for every family favor, volunteered for every community task. On the outside, he seemed generous and easygoing, but inside he felt resentful, exhausted, and unheard. One day, his therapist asked him a question that changed his life. When you say yes to others, what are you saying no to? That hit him hard, because most of the time his yes came at the cost of his health, his peace, or his dreams. James started practicing mindfulness, and he came across a simple Buddhist reminder. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. From then on, he made a rule for himself. He would pause before answering any request. Just a breath, just a moment to ask himself, do I have the space for this? Is this a true yes or a fearful one? And if it was a no, he said it, kindly, clearly, and without guilt. At first it was uncomfortable, but over time something beautiful happened. His stress lifted, his sleep improved, and his relationships became more honest, more balanced. In Buddhist teachings, there is deep respect for intentional silence, for the pauses that help us speak with wisdom rather than impulse. Saying no can be that kind of pause. It doesn't shut doors, it opens the door to a more authentic life, and it teaches those around you how to respect your boundaries because you finally start respecting them yourself. There's a certain kind of sadness that creeps in, not loud or dramatic, just a quiet ache. It shows up when you find yourself looking back a little too often. Maybe it's an old photo that stirs something in your chest, or a song that brings back a time when life felt fuller, freer, maybe even easier. You start to miss the person you used to be, the energy you had, the dreams you carried, the way the world seemed open and full of possibility. It's so human, so natural. But if we're not careful, that gentle longing turns into a heavy weight, one that keeps us from fully living the life that's unfolding right in front of us. Buddhism teaches us that attachment is one of the roots of suffering. And one of the most sneaky forms of attachment is nostalgia, holding tightly to the past, to a version of ourselves that no longer exists. The Buddha reminded us that everything is impermanent, including who we are. Our bodies change, our roles shift, our priorities evolve, and yet the mind clings. We measure our present against a past that only lives in memory, and often we come up short. I once met a woman named Priya who shared something really vulnerable with me. In her younger years, she was this bright, driven person, always moving, always leading, always achieving. But in her 50s, after a health scare and a career change, she felt like she'd lost herself. She told me, "I just don't feel like me anymore." She kept comparing her current self to that younger version, the one who seemed unstoppable. And every time she did, she felt small, less than broken. But then something shifted. She began meditating with a local Sangha, a Buddhist community, and one day during a Dharma talk, the teacher said, "The lotus blooms not in spite of the mud, but because of it." That line cracked something open in her. She realized she wasn't supposed to be the same person forever. Life wasn't asking her to go backward. It was inviting her to unfold into something new. We are not meant to remain the same. Growth isn't linear. And who you were back then, that version of you, served its purpose. It brought you here. But holding on to it too tightly is like trying to wear clothes that no longer fit. The more you cling to what was, the more you miss what is. There's also this subtle idea many of us carry, that we peaked in the past, that our best days are behind us. But that's just another story the mind tells when it's afraid of change. The present moment is always richer than we give it credit for. Right now you have wisdom you didn't have back then. You've survived things your younger self couldn't even imagine. You've grown in quiet ways, in deep ways, in ways that can't be captured in a photo or an old memory. The Buddha said, "Do not dwell in the past. Do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment." Not because the past was bad or the future isn't worth dreaming of, but because the present is where life actually happens. It's the only place we can make new choices, feel new joy, and experience real peace. There's a kind of emptiness that's hard to explain. It doesn't come from being alone. It comes from feeling incomplete without someone else. Maybe it's a partner, a child, a friend, or even just the idea of someone. You look to them to feel loved, validated, seen. When they're around, everything feels right. When they pull away, even just a little, it's like your world shifts, and suddenly peace feels out of reach. That feeling, that's emotional dependence, and even though it can come from love, it often leaves us feeling powerless, and we all want connection. That's natural. Buddhism doesn't ask us to become detached from people or live in isolation. In fact, the Buddha deeply valued Sangha, or spiritual community, knowing how essential it is to walk the path with others. But he also taught that true peace and stability must come from within. When our sense of worth or happiness is tied to someone else, we're handing them the key to our emotional state. And even with the best intentions, no one can carry that responsibility for long. I remember talking with a man named Elias. He'd been through a painful breakup, and even months later he couldn't stop checking his phone, hoping for a message. He said, "It's like I don't know who I am without her," and I could feel how deeply that hurt. He wasn't just mourning a relationship, he was mourning the version of himself that only existed when someone else was around to reflect him back. Through meditation and Buddhist practice, Elias began to reconnect with himself. Not just the roles he played in relationships, but the part of him that was still whole, even in solitude. One day during a Dharma talk, the teacher shared this. "No one outside you can make you complete, because you were never incomplete to begin with." That became his mantra. Slowly he started journaling, going on walks without music or distraction, and asking himself, not others, what he needed at each moment. And something began to shift. He wasn't waiting for someone to make him feel okay anymore. He was learning to meet himself. In Buddhism, there's this beautiful concept of the inner refuge. It means that instead of seeking comfort outside ourselves, we turn inward. We become our own safe space. We learn to hold our pain, our joy, our uncertainty, without needing someone else to fix or complete it. And from that place, we're no longer in relationships out of fear or dependency. We're in them from a place of fullness. It's not about becoming emotionally numb or pretending we don't need anyone. It's about building a strong foundation inside so that our connections can be healthier, more balanced, more real. When we release emotional dependence, we give others the freedom to just be themselves, not our saviors, not our emotional crutches. And we give ourselves the freedom to love without fear of falling apart. Think about it this way. When a tree is deeply rooted, it doesn't panic when the wind blows. It bends, it sways, but it doesn't break. Your inner peace is like those roots. And no matter what's happening around you, who comes, who goes, you remain steady, not untouched but unshaken. The Buddha taught that all things are impermanent. People change, seasons shift, relationships evolve. If we build our happiness on something that can be taken away, we'll always feel anxious, always grasping. But if we find peace within ourselves, we can weather anything. We can love freely without clinging. We can be present without fear. There's something strange about the way we hold on to things, not just emotionally, but literally. Tucked away in the back of closets, drawers and shelves are pieces of our past. A jacket that no longer fits but reminds you of who you were. A letter from someone no longer in your life. A souvenir from a trip that once meant everything. At first glance, these things seem harmless. But if you look closely, they can carry a kind of emotional weight that slowly, silently begins to clutter not just our homes, but our hearts. We keep these items because they represent something, a moment, a person, a version of ourselves we don't want to forget. But the deeper truth is, a lot of the time, we're not holding on to the thing. We're holding on to the feeling that came with it. And that's where it gets tricky. Because the Buddha taught that attachment, even to pleasant memories, can be a source of suffering. Not because memories are bad, but because clinging to them keeps us from being fully present. It ties us to what was and blocks us from what could be. I remember speaking to a man named Jonah who had kept a box in his attic for over a decade. It was filled with photos, love letters, and trinkets from a relationship that had ended painfully. He hadn't looked at it in years, but he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. "It's all I have left of that part of my life," he told me. But when he finally opened the box, instead of joy or nostalgia, what came rushing in was sadness, longing, and even anger. He realized then that what he had been preserving wasn't just memories, it was pain he hadn't let himself process. In Buddhism, there's a concept known as non-attachment, which doesn't mean we stop caring or feeling. It simply means we stop clinging. We let things and people and moments come and go with grace, like watching leaves float down a river. And when we hold on to objects tied to grief, resentment, or longing, we're not just keeping a memory. We're anchoring ourselves to an emotional state that no longer serves us. It can feel almost disrespectful to let go of certain things. You might think, if I give this away, am I giving up the person, the memory, the meaning? But here's something important to remember. The memory lives in you, not in the sweater, not in the box, not in the dusty frame on the shelf. You carry the essence of those moments in your spirit, in the way they shaped you, in the quiet lessons they left behind. A woman I knew named Asha once donated her late mother's clothes to a women's shelter. She told me it was the hardest thing she'd done, but also the most healing. "I realized I wasn't honoring my mom by keeping her things hidden away," she said. "I was honoring her by letting them go where they could do some good." That's the thing. We can transform our grief into generosity. We can turn the weight of our past into something lighter, something useful, something free. Clearing space isn't just about minimalism or tidy shelves, it's a spiritual practice. Every time we release something that no longer aligns with who we are today, we make room for clarity, for new memories, for peace. The Buddha reminded us to live in the present moment, not in the shadows of what once was. And sometimes, the simple act of letting go of a single item is like opening a window that's been shut for years. There's a certain kind of tiredness that sleep can't fix. The kind that settles into your spirit after too many one-sided conversations, too many relationships where you give and walk away feeling empty. You might not even notice it at first. It creeps in slowly. A friendship that always revolves around their problems. A relative who never has a kind word, only criticism. A partner who expects your energy but never offers any in return. It's subtle, not dramatic, but over time, it begins to chip away at your peace. We often tell ourselves that it's noble to stick it out, to stay loyal, to keep showing up no matter how drained we feel, especially if we care deeply about the person. But here's the truth: love and loyalty don't require self-neglect. And in the teachings of the Buddha, we are reminded that who we surround ourselves with directly affects our path toward peace. The Buddha spoke of kalyana mittata, spiritual friendship, relationships that uplift, inspire, and support us in living with wisdom and compassion. So why do we hold on to connections that leave us feeling worse instead of better? Sometimes it's guilt, sometimes it's fear of being alone, sometimes it's the hope that the person will change, but often it's simply because we've never given ourselves permission to believe that our energy matters, that it's okay to say this relationship is no longer healthy for me, not because you hate the person, not because you're better than them, but because your well-being matters too. I remember talking to someone named Malik. He had a childhood friend who for years leaned on him for everything: emotional support, financial help, constant reassurance. Malik always showed up, thinking it was what a good friend does. But the more he gave, the more the friendship took from him. He felt anxious every time his phone buzzed. He began to dread seeing his friend. Still, he stayed silent, afraid of seeming selfish. During a meditation retreat, Malik heard a simple but powerful teaching. You cannot serve others from an empty cup. And it hit him. He'd been trying to be generous, but he was running on fumes. He had mistaken overextending himself for kindness, when really he was abandoning his own needs. In Buddhism, we're taught the importance of balance. Even generosity, one of the core virtues, must be practiced wisely. If giving to someone continually costs you your peace, that's a sign to step back and reassess. It's not about blaming the other person, it's about honoring your own boundaries. Setting limits doesn't mean you stop caring. In fact, when done mindfully, it's one of the most compassionate things you can do for both of you. It creates space for the other person to grow and for you to heal. Just like pruning a plant helps it thrive, sometimes creating distance in a relationship allows new, healthier dynamics to take root. And let's be real, it's not easy. There might be grief, confusion, or pushback. But remember this: peace is not the absence of conflict, it's the presence of clarity. And choosing clarity in your relationships is a profound act of self-love. The Buddha encouraged us to walk the path with wisdom, surrounded by those who support our journey. He never said we had to carry everyone with us. He taught that right association is key to liberation. So if there's a connection in your life that constantly drains more than it gives, ask yourself, what am I holding on to, and what is it costing me? There's something deeply exhausting about always feeling like you have to explain yourself. You make a decision, maybe it's about your career, your lifestyle, your relationship, and instantly you feel the pressure to justify it, to explain why it makes sense, to make sure other people understand. You walk around carrying this invisible weight, constantly preparing your next defense, just in case someone questions your choices. It's not always dramatic, sometimes it's subtle, just a raised eyebrow or a quiet comment. But it chips away at your confidence, slowly convincing you that your inner truth needs someone else's approval to be real. Here's the thing, you don't owe anyone a story for how you choose to live your life. Not your parents, not your friends, not strangers on the internet. And yet, many of us fall into the trap of over-explaining because we've been taught to believe that our worth is tied to how well we fit into other people's expectations. We worry about disappointing them, about being misunderstood, about being judged. But in the teachings of the Buddha, there's a powerful invitation to live differently. Buddhism encourages us to walk the path of right intention, to act from a place of alignment with our own values, not from fear of what others might think. The Buddha never said you must be understood. What he offered instead was the wisdom of inner freedom, freedom from the opinions, attachments, and projections of others. I once met a woman named Clara who had spent most of her adult life doing what was expected. She got the degree, climbed the ladder, married the right person. From the outside, everything looked picture perfect. But inside, she felt hollow. She'd always wanted to teach art, to live simply, to spend more time in nature. But every time she brought it up, people would ask, "Why would you give up everything you've worked for?" And so she'd stay quiet, shrink her dreams, smile through her discomfort. Eventually, Clara reached a point where the discomfort of pretending was louder than the fear of judgment. She quit her job, moved to a smaller town, and started leading art workshops for kids. The peace she felt didn't come from applause, it came from finally listening to her own heart. "I stopped explaining," she told me. "Not because I didn't care, but because I realized I was never going to make everyone happy. So I chose to make myself happy instead." Buddhism teaches that authenticity is a form of liberation. When you stop needing others to agree with your path, you reclaim your power. And in doing so, you give others permission to do the same. You stop living your life like a courtroom trial, presenting evidence for every decision. Instead, you live it like a meditation, rooted, calm, aware. Think of how much energy we spend defending ourselves, explaining our why, bending to fit someone else's comfort. What if that energy could be used to create, to rest, to grow, to love? What if your choices didn't need to be defended, only honored? The Buddha once said, "Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without." That includes the peace of knowing that you are allowed to make choices that others don't understand. You are allowed to follow a path that doesn't make sense to someone else, because your life is yours, your truth is sacred, and you don't need to translate it for anyone else to validate it. Letting go isn't about losing. It's about making space. It's about releasing the weight that keeps you from moving freely. When we let go of what no longer serves us, whether it's a person, a belief, an object, or a fear, we return to ourselves. We rediscover peace. The Buddha said that you only lose what you cling to. And in that simple truth, there's deep wisdom. Each time you release something heavy, you reclaim your energy, your clarity, and your joy. So I invite you to reflect, what are you ready to release? What weight can you put down today? This is your life, your path. You deserve to walk it freely. Thank you for being part of the Buddhist journey. If today's reflection brought you peace or insight, I hope you'll subscribe and continue this journey with me. And remember, true peace isn't something far away. It's already within you, waiting to be uncovered, one gentle breath, one brave choice at a time.